3 points. First of all, that there was a controversy in the early church. Secondly, the Jewish Christians, the early followers of Jesus, were vegetarian and were against animal sacrifice. And the third point is that we have records of Jesus going into the temple and disrupting the animal sacrifice business in the temple. And I could just run briefly over these. The controversy in the early church. Here's what Romans says. This is Paul. I'll also say something briefly about historical evidence about Christianity, early Christianity. Most of it comes from the New Testament. Some of it comes from outside the New Testament. The earliest records that we have are from the letters of Paul. That's the earliest time when the record was written. Now the Gospels describe events about Jesus and describe who Jesus was, his teaching, and so forth. But they aren't written down until after the destruction of the temple in the year 70. Jesus died about the year 30. Okay, so this is Paul, and he's writing in the 50s. And he says, "As for the man who is weak in faith, welcome him, but not for disputes over opinions. One believes he may eat anything, while the weak man eats only vegetables. Let not him who eats despise him who abstains, and let not him who abstains pass judgment on him who eats," and so forth. Do not, for the sake of food, destroy the work of God. Everything is indeed clean, but it is wrong for anyone to make others fall by what he eats. It is right not to eat meat or drink wine or do anything that makes your brother stumble. So Paul is coming to the point of view of the people who are strong in faith, realize that actually we can eat anything. It doesn't matter. Eat meat, whatever. Eat animals sacrificed to idols, doesn't matter. But there are going to be some vegetarians in the early movement, and you don't want to make them upset. And so for this reason, you might want to not eat meat. And he says that he himself will never eat meat because he's afraid of upsetting the other Christians in the movement and dividing the movement. From Paul's point of view, the world is coming to an end. It's coming to an end very soon, and so there's no point in getting into a big argument about food. But if you go back and see what they're talking about, Paul is talking about there are a bunch of people in the early church who are not only vegetarians, but believe that vegetarianism should be required. And who are these vegetarians? Most likely, they're the leadership of the early church. James, Peter, and John. We know from other sources, Hippolytus, I believe, says that James, the brother of Jesus, was a vegetarian and was raised as a vegetarian and did not drink alcohol either. So we know that the leadership of the early church was vegetarian. And secondly, we know that the Jewish Christians, the later followers of Jesus who still considered themselves Jesus, tried to be good Jews and so forth, as they understood the law. Their version of the law was a little idiosyncratic, but still they saw themselves as Jews, and they were vegetarians as well. And we know this from the description of the church fathers and so forth. Now, the third aspect is that Jesus himself went into the temple and disrupted the animal sacrifice business. Now, the disruption of the temple, most Christians know this as Jesus goes into the temple and overturns the tables of the dishonest money changers. But actually, when you look at the gospel accounts, and this is one of the few stories in Jesus' life which is in all four gospels, they all have this incident, and they all describe Jesus as doing considerably more than just overturning tables. This is what John says. The Passover of the Jews was at hand, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. In the temple he found those who were selling oxen and sheep and pigeons, and the money changers at their business. And making a whip of cords, he drove them all, with the sheep and oxen, out of the temple, and he poured out the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. And he told those who sold the pigeons, take these things away. So Jesus is disrupting the animal sacrifice business in the temple. This is almost certainly what got Jesus killed, because Jesus was crucified. Crucifixion is a Roman punishment. Therefore, Jesus couldn't just be involved in some sort of theological dispute with other Jews about or commit some Jewish heresy. He had to do something which was against the public order. That is something the Romans would be upset. Going into the temple and creating a riot during the period of Passover, when the place was full, when Jerusalem was full of pilgrims who were all bringing their animals to the temple to be sacrificed, and so forth and so on. To do this was upsetting the public order, and so they had to act to deal with this. And so they said, "Who's causing the problem here? It's Jesus. Have him crucified." That's what got Jesus killed. It was in his action in going to the temple and disrupting the animal sacrifice business. And we know also that the early Jewish Christians were very much against animal sacrifice. They were even more against animal sacrifice in some ways than they were against meat eating. Because for most people, the early Christianity was a movement of the poor. It was the people that Jesus was talking to were other people who were basically the poor. They were not in the elite class. He wasn't preaching to the rich. In fact, he says, "Blessed are the poor," and says, give everything you have to the poor, and so forth and so on. And so it's clear in the Gospels that his message is directed towards those who are poor. And so if you're poor, you're probably going to be vegan most of the time in the ancient world. In fact, about 90%, 99% of the people in the ancient world were vegans just out of necessity. The time when you would be tempted to eat meat would be at festival times, both in the pagan world and in the Jewish world. You would have the Jewish Passover, you have pagan festivals, they'd kill an ox and pass out the meat to everybody and things like that. So the festival times were the real temptations to eat meat. So in a sense, they were actually more against animal sacrifice than they were against commercial meat eating. Because if you were going into the meat market to buy some food, you were by almost definition by definition in the elite class, in the 1%. When Paul says, for example, at one point in Corinthians, he says, "Eat whatever is sold in the meat market without asking any questions of conscience." If you were going into the meat market in the first place, you were in, if you were able to buy any meat, you were in the upper class. You were in the 1% of ancient Roman society. And so this is the time when the message started going to the upper class in Rome. And that actually, for better or worse, that actually helped promote Christianity, because when Christianity started getting into the upper class, then people started paying attention to it. And so it created more converts to Christianity, although it tended to dilute the message of vegetarianism, obviously, because now Paul's coming in and saying, well, we don't want to get in any big fights about vegetarianism, so just go along with whatever these people say, and it's okay to eat anything you want. We'll leave it up to everybody's conscience. And then, of course, by the time we get to the 20th century, 21st century, everybody's saying, well, okay, well, I guess then we can eat as much meat as we want, and then we've got, livestock and humans overrunning the planet.